Wells deniers. Why do you think that his friends told the cops that they didn't know the girl that he went with? Weird how in Warren's little interview he fails to mention that he spoke with the deputies and several friends claimed they didn't know the girl he left with. Right here, 1:30 in the morning. Even though they were supposedly texting with Katie, right? Didn't get their story straight yet. Right there, in black and white, the boys lied. Or are we going to pretend that this isn't evidence too? I'm not the kind of person that engages in drama, especially when it comes from creator to creator. But when one of my mutuals is out here trying to gaslight people about the Nolan Wells case, on top of insulting my intelligence, well, then I'm going to have to drag you, honey. Let's just go ahead and read this section of the report together out loud, and then I'll play you her take, and you can tell me if it's full-on gaslighting or not. Approximately 1:38 hours on July 5th, 2026, Carone spoke with Ocean Springs Police Department regarding the complaint and advised that JCO would be taking the lead on the case. Carone also spoke with JCSO Lieutenant Odom, the shift supervisor, who said that they had taken the initial report. He said his deputies had spoken with several friends that traveled to the island on the vessel with Nolan, and that when they left, he was in the company of an unknown female, and that he chose to remain on the island.
That doesn't say the boys spoke to the cops at 1 a.m. It says that the two officers spoke to each other at 1:30 in the morning. And then the one officer relayed to the other officer that what the individuals had said at that time. Not that the boys spoke to the police at 1 o'clock in the morning. Is reading comprehension that hard for you people? Is reading comprehension that hard? Is reading comprehension that hard? I'm really trying to understand why it's so difficult when you read a document that you can't comprehend what the words are saying in the document.
Yeah, is reading comprehension that hard, Stephanie? Because you're trying to say that the deputies didn't speak to the boys, and that the boys aren't lying about Katie being an unknown female, nor are they lying about saying that they didn't speak to the police until July 7th. So let's break this down together. If Nolan's mother called the Marina Dispatch at 11:49 on July 4th, then 1:3800 hours would be July 5th, 2 hours later. The MDMR lieutenant then spoke to the Ocean Springs Police Department and then spoke to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, who was taking the lead on the case. Lieutenant Odom, who was the shift supervisor, took the initial report. The sheriff's office told Lieutenant Carone that his deputies had spoken with several of his friends that had traveled to the island on the vessel with Nolan. So that means between 11:30 and 1:30, the deputies spoke to several friends. Those deputies then reported back to Lieutenant Odom, who then relayed the message to the Marina's lieutenant. Now, it's safe to assume that the first person that they would talk to would be Warren, who was the one who reached out not only to Nolan's mother, but the Coast Guard. We knew that Nolan's friends all knew Katie because Warren said that they were all text messaging her the next day. So not only did Warren lie about all of them not talking to the police until July 7th, they clearly lied about this being an unknown female to them. Your excuse for that phrasing is that the police just didn't know who this girl was, that Warren or his friends definitely would have told the police about it, and the cops just chose not to include that in their report. But that doesn't make sense because all people in all reports are unknown to the police. This made you look really bad, Stephanie. The absolute nerve of you, Stephanie, to say that you won't engage in my crazy conspiracy theories as if you weren't standing there right next to me during the Karen Reed case. That's why we're mutuals. You have no problem seeing the conspiracy when it comes to Karen Reed, yet when it came to Carmelo Anthony or Nolan Wells, suddenly you're ride or die for the people that are giving inconsistent stories. I told her I would be willing to hop on a live with her and we can definitely discuss all these inconsistencies. But I don't think she will, because I've been suspecting for a while now that she's being paid by somebody for her opinions. Because there is nobody dirtier in this world than a MAGA lawyer from Florida. And I am genuinely concerned that you are a defense attorney and this is what you do. Because the only other options are either you're the one with a reading comprehension problem or you're a shitty lawyer. And I've spent a year calling out your bad takes privately and publicly. but I'm done. Because anybody who would take a grieving mother's Instagram post as proof of something over an official report that proves that witnesses are lying is a bad person. Or you can be a good person and admit that you're wrong and apologize to your followers.
The official records surrounding this case don't simply repeat the same story. Each one adds another piece to the timeline. But one document may have just clarified something investigators had never publicly pinned down with this level of precision: the exact moment the missing person case was formally reported. The document is an MDMR Marine Patrol Incident Report, number PM2607-16, and according to that report, the clock read 23:49 on July 4th, 11:49 p.m., when MDMR Lieutenant Patrick Caron was contacted by dispatch regarding a missing person. For weeks, the public timeline has generally placed that call around midnight, but the official record narrows it down further, not approximately midnight, 11 minutes before it. The report identifies the caller as Christine Wells-Wonsley and records what she told dispatch that night. Her 18-year-old son, Nolan, had traveled to Horn Island by boat with friends. He had last been seen at approximately 1500 hours, 3 p.m., a time that matches the timestamp appearing throughout the other records examined in this case. But then comes a detail that changes the picture slightly. According to this report, Nolan's phone was not with him. It was inside a friend's truck. That distinction matters because earlier accounts had offered a much simpler explanation. Officer Tatum's on-location reporting had described phones generally being left behind on boats while people were participating in water activities. Under that explanation, Nolan's phone being somewhere else wasn't necessarily unusual. But the Marine Patrol report provides a more specific location. The phone wasn't sitting on a boat. It was inside a friend's truck. And that leaves investigators and anyone examining the timeline with a basic question that does not require speculation to ask. How did Nolan's phone get into a vehicle on the mainland if Nolan himself had not yet returned from the island? There are several possible explanations. Someone could have brought the phone back earlier, perhaps intending to return it later. Or there could still be portions of the day's movements, who traveled where, when they traveled, and who was carrying Nolan's belongings, that have not been publicly reconstructed in complete detail. Report also confirms something that had circulated in earlier accounts, but now appears in an official record with a specific time, caller, and documented location. And that level of detail could matter when the timeline is examined minute by minute. The friends told authorities that they had all made it back from the island. That statement is preserved in the official record, and it represents one of the most consequential claims in the early timeline. According to the group, everyone had returned, except Nolan. From that point, the report shows the initial response moving through the appropriate agencies with relatively little delay. On paper, at least, the sequence appears straightforward. Lieutenant Caron instructed dispatch to direct Christine to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office so she could make an official missing person report with the agency responsible for the case. Shortly afterward, dispatch documented that Christine was already communicating with JCSO, while the United States Coast Guard had also been notified. That sequence is important because it challenges one version of the timeline that is circulated in earlier coverage, the idea that authorities simply did nothing for roughly 9 hours after Nolan was reported missing. This document doesn't support that conclusion. The record shows movement within minutes of Christine's call. The correct law enforcement agency was contacted, jurisdiction was transferred, and the Coast Guard was brought into the notification chain. Whatever happened afterward, the initial alert was not sitting untouched. So where does the real concern begin? According to this report, the critical gap wasn't the first notification. It was the assessment that followed. Less than 2 hours after Christine's call, another conversation would take place, one that would influence how the situation was treated for much of the following day. And this is where the document becomes especially significant. Because the next entry doesn't simply record another notification. It captures an early institutional judgment about the situation, a judgment that, viewed against everything that would unfold later, may have underestimated the seriousness of what was happening on Horn Island. At 1:38 a.m. on July 5th, less than 2 hours after Christine first contacted authorities, that next step was documented, and what happened during that conversation would become one of the most important pieces of the early response timeline. At 1:38 a.m., Lieutenant Caron spoke with JCSO Shift Supervisor Lieutenant Odom about Nolan's disappearance. And according to the Marine Patrol report, what Odom relayed during that conversation may be the most consequential detail in the entire document. Odom said deputies had already spoken with several members of the group who had traveled to Horn Island with Nolan. Their account, as recorded in the report, was that when the group eventually departed, Nolan was with an unidentified female and had decided to remain on the island. That information shaped the next judgment. Based on what his deputies had learned, Odom told Caron that he had no reason to believe there was a water-related emergency or immediate exigency. Instead, the working theory documented at the time was much simpler. Nolan may have gotten a ride back on another vessel and simply did not have his phone with him to contact his family. Placed beside everything that would emerge later, that assessment becomes difficult to overlook. An unknown woman, a voluntary decision to stay, no apparent emergency. and the possibility that Nolan had simply returned on another boat without his phone. What makes this significant is that this explanation did not first appear days later, after the controversy surrounding the sheriff's public comments about the possibility of foul play. It was already written into the official record at 1:38 in the morning, less than 2 hours after Nolan was reported missing. At that point, the search had not yet begun in earnest. No one had systematically searched the shoreline. There had been no sonar operation, no drone deployment, and no extensive multi-agency sweep of the island, and the report documents what happened next. No further action was taken by Lieutenant Karen or his shift during the morning of July 5, 2026. That single sentence provides the clearest documented explanation yet for why the response did not immediately escalate. The initial alert had been made, the proper agencies had been notified, but the information passed between deputies and supervisors produced an assessment that Nolan was probably not facing a water-related emergency. To be clear, the document does not establish that anyone deliberately ignored a danger. Lieutenant Odom was making a judgment based on the information his deputies had obtained from people who had been with Nolan earlier that night. If authorities genuinely believed an 18-year-old had chosen to remain on the island, possibly found another ride back, and simply had no phone, a lower priority response would not necessarily have appeared unreasonable in that moment. But hindsight changes the weight of that decision, because the real issue is not simply that the initial assessment turned out to be wrong, it's what that assessment meant for the hours that followed. As this case has been examined across previous reports, a full multi-agency search did not begin in earnest until after sunrise on July 5th, hours after this early morning conversation effectively ended the immediate response. And this newly documented timeline explains why. The delay did not begin because Nolan's disappearance was never reported. It began because the first assessment concluded there was no water emergency requiring an immediate search. And that conclusion would become one of the most consequential decisions in the entire timeline. There is another detail in that same paragraph that deserves a closer look. The words unknown female. Those two words appear in an official law enforcement record from the very first night. And at minimum, they show that Katie's identity was either not established for the responding officers at that moment, or was not communicated to them. That is significant because multiple people in the group apparently knew who she was. Whether that represents a genuine communication gap between what deputies were told and what the friends themselves knew, or whether there was another explanation, cannot be determined from this document alone, but the documented fact remains. During the earliest hours of the investigation, the person reportedly with Nolan during his final known movements was not identified by name in the official report. She was simply described an unknown female. And that detail helps explain something this case has struggled to reconcile. The early response does not require a conspiracy theory to understand. It does not require assuming someone deliberately concealed information. The record points towards something more ordinary, and potentially more consequential. An initial risk assessment was made in good faith, using incomplete information passed through multiple people. But that assessment was wrong. And because it was wrong, the response that night did not immediately develop into the kind of search and rescue operation the circumstances might have warranted. That explanation is, in some ways, more unsettling than a theory involving deliberate withholding. Because it shows how quickly an entire response can be shaped by a single conversation, and by an assumption that sounds reasonable until later evidence begins to contradict it. Then the report reaches July 5th. And buried in its final section is another detail that has not received the attention it deserves, an actual documented sonar search. At approximately 1,800 hours, 6 p.m., Lieutenant Karen reported to a command post established by JCO at Lake Mars Pier. He also documented his unit's assistance with the search, including an MDMR patrol vessel and crew being sent toward the northwestern end of Horn Island. The purpose was specific. They were conducting sonar surveys of the area. And the report records the result plainly. The sonar surveys were inconclusive and were ultimately stopped because of adverse weather conditions. That changes the picture of the July 5th search. By 6 p.m., investigators were no longer relying only on people searching from the surface or scanning the shoreline. They had moved to underwater search technology in an effort to locate Nolan. And the location being examined was particularly important. The northwestern tip of Horn Island. That is the same general area where Nolan's body would eventually be recovered the following morning. So this was not simply a broad sweep of the island with no defined target. A specific area had been identified. A sonar operation had been launched. And then the weather brought it to an end before investigators could obtain a conclusive result. Which leaves one of the most difficult details in this timeline, sitting almost silently inside an otherwise routine incident report. The location search by sonar on July 5th was the same area where Nolan would be found less than a day later. And the first underwater search there had ended without an answer. The search had already narrowed in on the exact area where Nolan would eventually be recovered. And yet, the sonar operation produced no conclusive result. It was stopped because of weather, leaving investigators without a definitive answer about what was beneath the surface. That detail matters because it connects directly to one of the central questions this case has raised from the beginning, and one that has never been completely resolved. How could Nolan's body ultimately be recovered in essentially the same area where he was last known to be? Ben Crump has repeatedly raised questions about the timing and location of that recovery, particularly when considering how ocean currents can influence where a body may travel over the course of 2 days. Now, this report adds an important piece of information that had not been widely incorporated into that discussion. Authorities were already conducting sonar searches in that specific area less than 24 hours after Nolan disappeared. And they did not get a clear result. That does not automatically tell us why. It could mean Nolan was not in that location at the time the search was conducted. It could mean the conditions or equipment prevented investigators from detecting him. Or it could reflect the known difficulty of conducting underwater searches in shallow, current-driven coastal waters like those surrounding the northwestern portion of Horn Island. In 9 night. Those possibilities matter because sonar is not an infallible underwater camera. Its effectiveness can be influenced by weather, water movement, visibility, depth, equipment performance, and the characteristics of whatever investigators are trying to locate. So, the fact that nothing conclusive was detected does not by itself establish that Nolan was not there, but it also cannot simply be ignored. The report confirms that investigators were looking in the very area that would later become central to the recovery, and they were using underwater search technology to do it. That directly adds context to the question that has fueled so much discussion around the case, how that is the way that people were working for a lot of discussion around the case. As discussed in earlier coverage, Crump's team has consulted ocean engineering experts to examine the apparent discrepancy between the last known timeline and the eventual recovery location. The question is whether currents in that particular stretch of coastline could produce movements that are difficult to predict intuitively. That possibility is consistent with earlier public comments from coroner Bruce Lynn, who has described the currents in the area as unusually dangerous and unpredictable. But there is another possibility that is just as important to acknowledge. The first sonar operation may simply have been unable to detect what investigators were looking for. Adverse weather had already interrupted the search. And underwater detection in a shallow, moving coastal environment has limitations that can make a negative search result far less definitive than it might sound. That is why this report is so valuable. It does not solve the recovery location mystery. It does something more useful. It establishes that professionals were already conducting a targeted underwater search in the relevant area less than a day after Nolan disappeared, and that focused search still failed to produce a conclusive answer. That is a meaningful piece of evidence for anyone trying to determine whether Nolan's eventual recovery location was genuinely anomalous, or whether it could be explained by the unpredictable realities of underwater searches, currents, weather, and coastal conditions. And when this document is placed alongside everything that has happened since Nolan disappeared, a much clearer picture of the case begins to emerge. Not necessarily a simpler one, but a more documented one. What emerges from the full record is not another theory, but a timeline increasingly built around documented institutional actions. And the biggest confirmed development is now clear. The state's official autopsy has been completed. It is no longer pending. It is not awaiting completion. Officials confirmed to NBC News and other outlets that the examination has been finished. But completion does not mean public release. According to District Attorney Angel Mers-Marth's repeated public statements, the findings will remain confidential for now and will instead be presented to a grand jury alongside the other evidence collected during the investigation. Marth addressed that issue publicly on July 23, emphasizing that the procedure was not created specifically for Nolan's case. According to her explanation, deaths investigated by the county are routinely presented to a grand jury, with exceptions including natural deaths and certain non-criminal automobile fatalities. Her broader point was clear. This is standard procedure within the county's death investigation process, not necessarily an extraordinary decision designed to keep information about Nolan's case from the public. That distinction matters, because the absence of a publicly released autopsy report can easily become part of the speculation surrounding a case. But the official explanation points toward an existing legal process in which the findings are being provided directly to the grand jury. And there is another development that adds a separate layer to the evidence. An independent 22-page analytical review has now examined material from across the case, including photographs, video, GPS information, and witness accounts. Its conclusion is notably more restrained than many of the theories circulating publicly. The review does not identify a person responsible. It does not determine that a crime occurred, and it does not assign criminal or civil liability. Instead, it identifies a remaining problem in the timeline, a significant gap between Nolan's last independently corroborated sighting and the moment the boat departed Horn Island. That distinction is critical. The report is not saying that the gap proves wrongdoing, it is saying the gap still needs to be explained. And that may be one of the most important distinctions in this entire investigation. A formal analytical review can acknowledge that unanswered questions remain without turning those questions into accusations. In that sense, the document reinforces a position this investigation has repeatedly arrived at. There are genuine gaps in the known timeline, but those gaps do not, by themselves, establish who, if anyone, is responsible for Nolan's death. Then there is the issue of threats surrounding the case. Those threats have produced at least one concrete legal consequence. Joseph Dumas of California was arrested after authorities accused him of making a social media threat against Chancery Court Judge Ashley Cole, whose role in this case has received extensive attention. Judge Cole had previously been discussed in connection with the emergency response surrounding the investigation and later became the target of online harassment serious enough to draw federal attention. That development is important for another reason. As the investigation has continued, the public debate surrounding Nolan's death has become increasingly intense. But the official record is beginning to separate two very different things: legitimate unanswered questions about the evidence and claims or conduct that cross into unsupported accusation or criminal threats. And as the autopsy findings move toward the grand jury, the independent review identifies unresolved timeline gaps and investigators continue working through the evidence. The case is entering a stage where documentation, rather than speculation, may ultimately determine what happened to Nolan. This is the first confirmed arrest connected to the wider events surrounding this case, but the distinction is crucial. The arrest was not made in connection with Nolan's death. It involved an alleged threat against a person connected to the investigation. That difference matters. After roughly 6 weeks of Nash active messages came to arrest for a turning point which might be sent to provide persecution before me. The only confirmed arrest arising from the broader controversy has so far involved alleged harassment or threats directed at someone connected to the case, not an arrest for what happened to Nolan himself. And there is another warning that deserves just as much attention. State officials have publicly cautioned people about fabricated documents circulating online and being presented as though they were genuine records from Nolan's investigation. That is precisely why the MDMR report examined in this video needs to be treated carefully. A document appearing online does not automatically make it authentic. And with officials themselves warning about fake records, every purported leak or official document connected to this case deserves independent verification before being treated as evidence. The reason is simple. 6 weeks of intense national attention have created an information environment where genuine records, disputed material, unverified claims, and fabricated documents can easily come mixed together. This case has already generated controversy surrounding alleged audio, photographs, timelines, witness accounts, and other material whose authenticity or interpretation has been questioned. So, where does the investigation actually stand? The state's autopsy has been completed, but its findings remain sealed and are expected to be presented to the grand jury. An independent 22-page analytical review has identified a genuine unresolved gap in the timeline, while explicitly stopping short of assigning criminal or civil responsibility to anyone. Ben Crump's team continues examining questions surrounding the water environment and the available digital evidence, including phone-related information. And one confirmed arrest has occurred in the wider case environment, not for Nolan's death but over alleged threats directed at someone connected to the investigation. At the same time, officials are warning the public that fabricated documents are circulating, adding another layer of difficulty to an investigation already surrounded by conflicting claims. Taken together, those developments point toward a conclusion that is far less sensational than many theories circulating online, but far more firmly grounded in the available record. The investigation is moving through institutional channels. The evidence is being reviewed. The unresolved timeline remains unresolved, and the state's autopsy findings are now part of the material being held for the grand jury process. But after weeks of national attention, the central question remains unanswered: what actually happened to Nolan Wells? For now, that answer remains inside evidence that has not been publicly released, within an investigation that is still developing, and ultimately in the hands of the Jackson County grand jury. Until that process produces something definitive, the gaps in the timeline remain questions, not conclusions.